Compiler directives are often used to make an application work differently depending on the build profile. You learned about build profiles in Lesson 1.3. In this lesson, you'll use the if directive to compile certain code only if the project is compiled using a build profile that defines the debug constant. By default, the debug profile defines the debug constant. You'll learn more about constants later in Lesson 5.4. Note that as well as being useful for selectively compiling code using the if directive, the debug constant is also relevant to the system.diagnostics namespace. Some of the methods in the system.diagnostics namespace are able to detect the debug constant and react accordingly. You'll see how this works in Lesson 5.8. To begin this lesson, open the Market Trader project from your Sample Files folder. And open site.master in Design View. This is a master page. Master pages are covered in Session 12 of the Essential Skills course in this series. Every page that is associated with a master page inherits both the layout and any C# code that is included in the master page. Every page in this project is associated with this master page. Notice that there is a label control in the top right corner named Label Debug. You're going to add a compiler directive that will show a message in the label only if the project is built using the debug profile. Now open the code behind file of site.master, and you're going to add some code to display a message in the Label Debug control. Add the following code to the page load event handler. Label debug.text equals debug mode not for release. This code will run regardless of which profile is used to build the project. You'll need to add a compiler directive in order to change this. So let's now add a compiler directive to compile this code only if the debug constant is present. Add a new line to the start of the page load event handler and add the following code. #if debug, and add a new line to the end of the page load event handler and type #endif. The compiler directives appear to the far left of the rest of the code. This is to indicate that they will only affect the compiler and aren't part of the programming logic itself. When the compiler runs, it will see the #if directive and will compile the label debug.text line of code only if the debug constant is present. This means that the code will be entirely omitted from the built version of the site if the debug constant is not enabled. You may remember seeing the option for the debug constant in Lesson 1.5. Let's now test the project using the debug profile. First, make sure that Debug is selected from the drop-down menu on the top toolbar. Now click Debug, Start Debugging. Your message appears in the top right corner, as expected. When you run the project in debug mode, it is automatically built using your selected build profile. Because the debug profile has the debug constant enabled, your compiler directive allowed the code to be compiled. Close your web browser now and return to Visual Studio. Now let's test the project using the Release profile. Select Release from the drop-down menu on the top toolbar and click Debug, Start Debugging. This time there is no message in the top right corner. Your compiler directive did not find the debug constant because it isn't enabled in the Release profile. This is a good way to ensure that you don't accidentally release an unoptimized debug version of your code. Close your web browser now and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 5.2. Use the if directive to selectively compile code.